Okay, I think we will make a start then. My name's Gawain Little. I'm the General Secretary at the General Federation of Trade Unions, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's first session in our in this year's Trade Union and Working Class History series. Really looking forward to this. I think it's a really important part of our education program. If we don't learn from our past, it's difficult to organise in our present to build the future that we all want to see. So it's a crucial part of the learning that we believe in at the GFTU. This year we focused the Trade Union Working Class History series on the role of women in trade union and working class history. And so really excited to kick off with our first session today, beginning that right back at the beginning, as it were. A couple of bits of housekeeping just before we begin. You will see a behaviour statement that has been posted in the chat or is about to be posted in the chat. Please read through that. You won't find anything surprising in here, but we do take the behaviour of people in sessions very seriously at GFTU. This should be a comradely space of solidarity where we can all learn together in a respectful way. In terms of the chat, most people will be used to this, but it is a webinar, so you won't be able to see or hear yourself at this point. But what we do have, after we've had our presentation, what we do have is a box at the bottom of your screen marked Q&A. If you would like to drop any questions into that box while our speaker is talking this evening, then we will put those questions to our speaker at the end of the session, and hopefully that will launch us into a bit more back and forth discussion around the topic. But that brings me on to introducing our fantastic speaker for this evening. I'm really pleased to welcome Professor Katrina Navickas to join us for, I think, is this the third time that you've presented on our Trade Union Work Class History series. So Katrina is Professor of History and Director of the Heritage Hub at the University of Hertfordshire. She is a historian of protest, social and political movements, and contested public spheres in England from the late 18th century to the present day. She's got research interests in 20th century modernist architecture, town and country planning, and landscape change as well, and is one of the founders of the Rural Modernism Research Network. We are really pleased that Katrina is able to join us today to launch this year's series. So without further ado, Katrina, over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you ever so much, Gawain, and thank you all for inviting me back. I'm really pleased to be here again. I hope you enjoy this talk. So I'm just going to share my slides. Hopefully everyone can see that. Is that okay?
Yeah,
Great.
we've got the slides up.
Super. So this is an introductory lecture about where the role of women started in the democratic and trade union movements in Britain. So it's going to be quite broad brush. Maybe we can ask some more detailed things in the questions. So here we go. So the first thing I thought I'd hit you with while you're still awake is a bit of theory. We're trade unionists, we like some theory. There's some quite predominant ideas around the role of men and women and different genders in the 18th century that really come into understanding why women were excluded from politics and also from the workplace in early industrialising Britain. And historians tend to call it separate spheres, although that term didn't really exist at the time. We see a lot of propaganda, a lot of writing, a lot of different types of literature that seem to suggest that men and women live in different spheres, different worlds, so to speak. And although we know that the reality is not as simple as that, it's not as binary as that, certainly there's a lot of material that suggests that that's the ideal. That men are suited to the workplace, they are suited to having public lives in politics, and have particular characteristics that are specifically masculine, whereas women are meant to be domestic, living at home, looking after the children and the home, and doing womanly jobs and having particular feminine characteristics. Again, we know that that's not the case and that many people don't conform to those binaries, but certainly it seems that there is a lot of material that suggests that that was the ideal. So the cartoon, I just picked one randomly. There's many from the British Museum catalogue, showing the kind of the man doing the work. I think is a tailor or maybe a woolcomber there, and the woman being at home looking after the hearth. So that is seen as the kind of ideal divide. It's quite often debated about whether this is a middle class ideal, because obviously working class women always have worked, whether in the home or outside the home. We know that the family can't have a breadwinner that is just male. Working class families in the 18th and 19th centuries need all people, men, women, children, to contribute to the family income. So the separate spheres model is quite often seen as a middle class idea, that the middle class women stay at home and look after the children, and the men go out to work and have a public life. But certainly, this idea is used to justify why women can't be part of politics, why women shouldn't be in the workplace as well. And so that's the kind of overriding ideology that you might see in a lot of the sources. And it's something that women and men challenge in this period. So, in the 18th century, before the rise of demands for democracy, both for men and women, the most common form of protest was what we call food riots. So, riots in marketplaces over the price of food and food shortages, and often contemporary sources call this a revolt of the housewives, slightly pejoratively, because women are seen as leading that type of protest. So the cartoon there by Cruikshank from 1800 shows a marketplace riot, where the crowd are trying to drag the merchant who's accused of putting up prices, taking advantage of harvest failure and wartime shortages. And women are seen as taking quite a significant role in those types of riots. So the older lady on the left hand side in the red dress is kicking him up the bum, hitting him with a pair of tongs. Again, that feeds into this separate spheres idea of when women are seen in public, they're doing something that's not feminine, that it's violent, that it's overly emotional, but also this idea that women knew the price of what should be fair in wheat prices or food prices generally. So the Marxist economist and economic and social historian E.P. Thompson wrote about the moral economy of the 18th century food riot, when the crowd, the marketplace knew what a fair price should be for goods and services, and if merchants, middle classes are seen as profiting from that or taking advantage of shortages, then the crowd has a moral right to bring down prices through violence or other means. But it's interesting that there is a debate about, were women significantly more present at these types of protest in the 18th century or not? It's unresolved, that debate, but we certainly see lots of records of women and teenagers being involved in these types of protest. But they're generally not seen as involved in politics necessarily on a popular scale in the 18th century, certainly not before the rise of demands for the vote. But that's not to say that women weren't involved in politics on other levels. So we see plenty of aristocratic women being involved in elections. The most famous of whom was Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, who was involved in the Whig campaigns for various elections in Westminster, Middlesex, in the 1780s, most prominently in the 1784 election. And again, we see that idea of separate spheres coming in a lot of the political propaganda of the time. So we see examples like this cartoon done by Rowlandson, which is quite derogatory of Georgiana and her female friends who are getting involved in the election campaigning for the leading candidate, Charles James Fox, who's a Whig supporter of the American Revolution, fairly radical, although he's not as he doesn't support democracy, but he is in support of reform. And she's criticised quite heavily for being involved in the campaign. So her and her friends, you can see they've got Fox written in their hats, supporting Charles James Fox. But here we see that she's criticised for essentially selling kisses for votes is essentially what's going on here. That she's kissing butchers. So the two guys there are butchers. There's butchers' meats hanging up on the right hand side, and so there's a kind of criticism both of her using her sexuality on the campaign trail, but also going below her class. She's associating with lower class men to try and get their votes. Um, Westminster here is an unusual case in that it has a very wide franchise. The borough of Westminster allows working class men to vote. It's anyone who's got essentially rents a house in Westminster. So people like butchers do have the vote. It's a huge franchise. So therefore it becomes a very contested borough. Lots of different politicians trying their luck. Obviously, it's in the centre of power as well. So it becomes this kind of flashpoint for anyone who's got radical ideas to try and contest. So Georgiana comes across as having a lot of publicity. She's all over the papers, all over the political satire and cartoons. There's a lot of criticism of her for being involved in politics because she's seen as crossing the separate spheres, even though she's aristocratic and generally people give rich people a lot more leeway for this. There's still a lot of misogynist critique of her role in these elections, but it is quite common for aristocratic women to be involved in not just campaigning for their chosen candidate, but also holding parties, balls, dinner parties, as a way of what's called treating the voters, trying to persuade them to vote for their candidates. Elections in the 18th century are hugely corrupt, involve a lot of money, trying to persuade people to vote in a particular way. And this was one way in which certainly upper class women had agency and political say in the system by getting involved organising these sorts of events. Um, but it's not until the French Revolution that newer ideas about female suffrage start to emerge. Quite often they're placed at the feet of Mary Wollstonecraft. Again, middle class, highly connected writer in North London, very well connected, obviously married to William Godwin, so in a philosophical, um, Unitarian, so radical Protestant thinker, um, very radical in terms of where she stood on a lot of ideas. But I want to stress here that even Mary Wollstonecraft isn't campaigning for female suffrage. It's still too early in history for female suffrage to be seen as a general right. Most men don't have the vote in the 18th century. Democracy is still seen as a very bad word. It's associated with the American Revolution, but by the 1790s, it's associated with the French. And even radical thinkers who support the French Revolution are still campaigning just for male votes at this time, when most of the middle class men don't have the vote. So Mary Wollstonecraft is interesting as a political thinker, very radical political thinker, philosopher, writer, and she writes A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792, so still at the early stages of the French Revolution. It's in response to the first part of Thomas Paine's Rights of Man, which is the best-selling book publicising the French Revolution and its early achievements, publicising the idea of democracy, publicising the idea of a much more democratic system that doesn't involve a monarchy or an established church, doesn't involve House of Lords. Um, and so she basically says, what about the rights of women too? But she's not advocating female suffrage in this book. She's advocating much more political education for women. She's advocating that women should have a key role in educating their children in political and social thought. But that's about as far as she gets in this book. It's quite a complex book. It's also in response to French thinkers and the French revolutionaries. It's very much a philosophical text. So, although she's seen as the founder, essentially, of modern feminism in Britain, the rights of women are not necessarily about political rights in terms of democracy at this stage. We're still too early for that, but that's not to denigrate her importance. But essentially, the French Revolution does spark new ideas about democracy, equal rights, particularly for the working classes, that haven't really been discussed before in Britain and globally. I'll take an interlude here before we go on to what happens next in terms of female suffrage. Labour history and trade unionism also has a difficult relationship with where they see where women should be. As I mentioned, women always work, always have worked. But this is also the period of the rise of the modern trade unions. Trade unions are essentially banned in 1799, 1800. The government under Pitt the Younger, Tory government, fears revolution because of what's going on over the Channel, fears combinations of workers. So trade unions are effectively banned from collective bargaining between 1799 and 1825. So we see other forms of collective action by groups of industrial workers in particular, most famously the Luddites in 1811, 1812. But what we see workers, the Luddites write quite a bit, and what we see the early industrial workers who are starting to organise in the early factories, early steam-powered factories, much more extensive mines as well, is that they are also opposed to women workers, not on safety grounds or gender grounds necessarily, but because women workers are seen as pulling wages down. Employers, because of the separate spheres idea, would automatically pay women and children less. So a lot of trade union campaigning, petitions to Parliament, petitions to the employers, and the Luddite writers are about preventing women and children from working and protecting male skilled workers. There's a lot of language about skill and arguments around that men are much more skilled than women. Again, we see that separate spheres idea that men are different from women. And we see interesting defenses of masculinity. So the most famous picture of a Luddite is this one, the leader of the Luddites, done contemporaneously with attacks in Lancashire in May 1812, which shows quite a masculine looking man wearing a cotton dress. And there are various theories why he's doing this. It might just simply be that's the material that they're making in the cotton factories, this kind of printed cotton muslin dress. But it also might be a kind of world turned upside down defense of male skill against women workers. There's also a defense here of apprentices. The apprenticeship system is breaking down. In 1813, government passes, well, repeals legislation that restricts the number of apprentices. So we see the rise of laissez-faire kind of neoliberal capitalism entering the market, that everyone should be able to employ who they want. So there's certainly defence in the working class male skilled trades of male work against female employment. So that is also a context here for attitudes to working class women. Um, After the end of the Napoleonic Wars, we see the rise of working class democratic societies, originally formed in the 1790s, but much more national after the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815-16. And this is really the start of the modern democratic movement campaigning for one man, one vote. Um, so it's interesting here why actually women start to be involved in this, even though essentially they're campaigning for the vote for their menfolk, for their brothers, their husbands. Um, and I've done some research quite a long time ago now on a big box of letters in the National Archives. You can actually download these for free as a PDF from the National Archives site if you want to, using that reference number there. But in 1817, the government suspends habeas corpus, or suspends the Habeas Corpus Act, which allows the Home Office to directly arrest anyone it suspects of doing any democratic activity, what it calls seditious activity. And the government directly arrests or sends out arrest warrants for most of the leaders of these working class democratic societies, which have grown up in mainly industrial cities and industrial regions, so are most prominent in the northern cities, Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, Glasgow. And the government decides to separate all the does that it arrests in different prisons across the country. It doesn't want these prisoners talking to each other. So we see that these radicals are separated in all the different jails across the country. And what it does is it also confiscates any letters that are going to these leaders while they're in prison under the suspension of habeas corpus. And in this box that is still in the National Archives, there are perhaps 150 letters to the prisoners that were confiscated and then sent to the government. So the jailer, the head of the jails, send on the correspondence in case there's something seditious. And when I look through this box, there are quite a lot of letters from the wives of the male working class leaders. And I've written an article about this, about how many of the leading radicals of the time, their wives actually really erudite, really literate, and very politically aware. And they're writing to their husbands, telling them what's going on in their absence. Um, Quite emotional. It's quite emotional to read these letters, but also that they're also aware of politics. They're also thinking about politics. Um, and these are quite rare to know. So we have a lot of writings from the men in terms of their petitions to Parliament or their diaries. We It's much rarer to see existing original evidence from particularly working class women. So these are quite rare examples of this early democratic movement and how it was organised, what they're thinking, how they're writing. 1817 is a bad year in terms of economics. It's post-war economic depression. There's a harvest failure. Prices are sky high. So a lot of the letters are about the poor conditions that the women are facing. So this one's just from Elizabeth Mitchell. If you can read this kind of copperplate, right? It's not too bad when you get used to it, but I've got some transcriptions of the other ones. So Joseph Mitchell from Liverpool's put in Coldbath Fields prison in London. Dear husband, I can't imagine what can be the reason you do not write to me, neither in answer to the postmaster or a letter. She doesn't know yet that her letters are being confiscated, so he doesn't even read these letters, and his letters to her are not sent out. So she's wondering why is my husband not writing back to me? Did you not see the sufferings me and my children undergo? You would not be like the whole world forget us in such a time of trouble if you would see the clamming round when sharing the scanty meal. So the spelling's not um 100%, but it's not spelling's still quite fluid at this point. So I think she's doing pretty well. And this is quite emotional writing. Charlotte Johnston in Manchester, her husband's put in Exeter jail. So these are, really far distances that the government is seriously concerned about these radicals and their potential for revolution. So she writes, I'm not sure if I've got a transcription of hers. No, but the woman that I think is the most political is Elizabeth Knight, who's married to John Knight, who's one of the leading Manchester radicals, who's, as we'll see, goes on the stage at Peterloo. He's put in Reading jail amongst other jails. They do get moved around, and I think she's the one who's most politically aware. She actually, I think, knows that her letters are being confiscated. So she knows that the Home Office and the jailers are going to read what she's going to write. So I think it's even braver of her to write political statements in her letters. Oh, so she knows the delivery of letters is very irregular. But as this negligence only concerns me of the swinish multitude, it is mere folly to complain. Swinish multitude is a term used by Thomas Spence, a Republican radical, ironically about what the government think about ordinary people, that we're just a herd of pigs. Um, I've endeavoured to collect the needful information on the subject of habeas corpus suspension, but as I apprehend many particles on political subjects be adverted to, the letter will be detained. So she knows if she writes anything more, her letters will be confiscated. So she'll only state that the suspension received royal assent on the 30th of June. So she's clearly reading about politics, talking about politics, and what's affecting them. This infernal bill is to continue until the 1st of March. Punishment I wish to see the advocates of this measure suffer is that they might be compelled to crawl in an existence with the same food and clothing that hundreds of thousands of wretched are now daily perishing under. So she wishes on the government the same conditions that the poor are experiencing. There are several of her letters in that collection. And this is where I got to think about what are the women doing while their husbands are in jail? And the question that arises is why do the women then get involved in campaigning for the vote, campaigning for suffrage, at least if for the menfolk. And I think it's because in this period when the men are no longer able to be active, they're talking amongst each other. They're sitting together in each other's houses, maybe in the coffee house or even in the pub, and talking about politics and how what they should do next. And there are some letters in the collection which complain about the fact that nothing's happening, that they want things to progress further politically. So I think this is the motivation for working class women to get involved more actively in organising politics in this period. And you see that in accounts of political meetings that then happen once the male leaders get back home after habeas corpus is reinstated and they're released from jail. So Samuel Bamford, another of the Manchester leaders, writes in his autobiography about the history of the whole of the democratic movement, and he describes a meeting in Saddleworth, which is on the Lancashire-Yorkshire border, where, and again, take this with a pinch of salt because he's trying to put himself as the hero of the story. He claims in the course of an address he insisted on the right and the propriety of females who were present at such assemblages in voting by show of hands for and against the resolutions at the meeting. This was a new idea, and the women were mightily pleased with it. The men being nothing dissentient, when the resolution was put, the women held up their hands amid much laughter, and ever from that time females voted with the men at the radical meetings. So again, there is a bit of separate spheres here within the working class movement, that the men are laughing at the fact that the women are daring to vote with them. And I think Samuel Bamford's a bit condescending here, even much later in his autobiography, about the women daring to put up their hands to vote for and against resolutions in this meeting. So women are always, even within so-called progressive movements, always coming across these attitudes to them being involved in politics, even in the most nascent form. But we see the first female radical societies form in 1819. It's debated where they form, but they certainly form in the northwest of England. Possibly Blackburn is the first one, or Manchester. I'm happy to claim for both of them. But there are portrayals of these women. And again, this is quite a misogynist portrayal in this cartoon. Many of the cartoons, the women taking the stage are anti-women. They are anti-women getting involved. They are very misogynist portrayals. So this is a Cruikshank cartoon, the Belle Alliance, or the Female Reformers of Blackburn, depicting the Blackburn Female Radical Society. And this is 4 days before the Peterloo Massacre. It's before we know about what goes on at Peterloo, but they're known to take the stage at the other big mass meetings that are occurring. So in the lead up to Peterloo, 6 months, at the start of 1819, the radical movement hold these huge meetings called mass platform meetings. They're quite often headed by Henry Hunt, who's the big kind of celebrity speaker of the time, but they're also headed by local societies. The female societies who'd originally played a ceremonial role presenting either a banner or a red cap of liberty, which is what you can also see on the cartoon, to the male presenters, also actually asked to speak, also present addresses from their group alone. And they are called female reform societies, and they are women only generally. And this is the first time you see working class women form political societies that we know of. So a huge turning point, I think, in the story. But they are immediately derided, as you can see. I think it's significant that the women are depicted wearing trousers or breeches, which again, separate spheres. It's like women pretending to be men, or women taking the role of men, and therefore they're portrayed as very ugly, as not fulfilling that kind of feminine ideal that the separate spheres binary seems to suggest. So there's quite a lot of this quite overly sexualized um, representation in the propaganda as well. Um, oh, there we can zoom in a bit. I forgot about that. Yeah. So you can see the originals of these on the British Museum website. There's another one in Chetham's library, in a newspaper called The Comet. We think this might be Mary Fildes, who's the leader of Manchester Female Reform Society. And again, it's a derogatory picture of one of these female radical meetings, this time indoors. It's showing them all drinking gin, so therefore suggesting, oh, women get drunk and pretend that they're involved in politics. There's kind of, again, quite sexualized activity. There's a man under the table trying to look up women's skirts and horrible things like that. So there's a lot of opposition, both amongst kind of polite society generally against working class women being involved in these societies, but also within the democratic movement itself. But then we see the Peterloo massacre. The female societies are quite prominent in the Peterloo massacre, which happens on the 16th of August, 1819, in central Manchester, when the largest reform demonstration is quite brutally put down by magistrates who send in untrained yeomanry and then the military in to cut down the crowd. And there's quite a lot of evidence. Michael Bush, the scholar, has looked at the statistics of women who were injured on the field. So out of the 18 who we know were killed, 4 were women and 1 was a child. Out of the 750 or so who we know were injured, 168 recorded as injured were women. So there seems to be quite an over-representation of women in the numbers who were injured, to about a ratio of about 3 to 1, how you'd expect them to be. There's various theories why. One is that the female reform societies all gathered near the front of the hustings, in front of the stage together, because they were part of the formal radical societies who went to the front and therefore were crushed or severely injured by the soldiers who were aiming to get to the front of the crowd. They're easily identifiable because they were all wearing white, to show their unity, to show their purity, ironically. So it's much more easy for the men to see them. It's alleged that the yeomanry were drunk and were misogynistically, deliberately attacking the women. And so the women in white are certainly seen as the greatest victims of the Peterloo massacre. And we know that because after Peterloo, there was a subscription relief book to pay for the medical costs of those injured. And for those of who came forward, and remember, it's still quite a brave thing to come forward to ask for money to get your medical bills paid for, to have your name in a book saying, yes, I was there at this meeting. Again, this is where we know that 168 women claimed at least some money. So I just picked a random page. You can, again, read it for free on the John Rylands University of Manchester Library website. You can look at the whole book. It's been digitized. This one's Elizabeth Bond claims 10 shillings for being struck by a truncheon on the right shoulder, and she was much bruised. And there's lots of examples of quite severe injuries of the women. What happens after Peterloo? The Queen Caroline affair is interesting. I won't go into it in detail, but after Peterloo, there's a huge clampdown by the government on radical protest. The severe legislation passed, the Six Acts in late 1819, which prevent a lot of protest and what's called seditious activity. So the big demonstrations banned. Lots of radicals are thrown in prison. and put on trial. But in 1820, Queen Caroline, who's married to the Prince Regent, comes back to Britain to claim her throne when the Prince Regent ascends to the throne as George IV. Everyone hates the Prince Regent, and Queen Caroline gets celebrated as this folk hero, which is kind of ironic because she doesn't care for the working classes at all. But it's a legal way of protesting for all these women. She's particularly popular amongst women, working class women, who see her as some sort of figurehead for women's rights, even though there's no way she wants women's rights. She's a European aristocrat. But there's huge demonstrations in support of her claim to the throne. Prince Regent's trying to divorce her, literally airs her dirty laundry in the House of Lords, where you have to get a divorce. But the Queen Caroline affair is significant because it allows people to legally protest because you're in support of a queen. It's seen as kind of patriotic. It fizzles out quite quickly. Queen Caroline accepts a settlement, gets paid off, and then dies quite soon afterwards. But it is a kind of firework of kind of protest that allows women's voices to be heard again. So this brings us to the last democratic movement I want to talk about, that has, again, another problematic relationship with female suffrage, and that's the Chartists in the 1840s, the next big working class democratic movement. This is an example of their membership card, the National Charter Association, which seems to put men and women on an equal setting. Women can join the movement. But I think there's an argument to say that Chartists are much more reluctant to push for women's suffrage, certainly in the early stages in the 1840s, than perhaps the radical societies of the Napoleonic War period were. There's a kind of step backwards. History can go backwards as well as forwards in terms of progress. So all the Chartist leadership are men. They're much less likely to have women on any local committees. Women do act as lecturers for the movement, spreading the word of Chartism, but there's very little talk of female suffrage in Chartism. They are focused completely on the 6 points of the Charter, which is getting the men the vote. And so women are seen as taking a domestic role in Chartism, again, organising meetings, organising tea parties, and educating the children about Chartism, but not taking a leading role in the National Convention and the much more bureaucratic and perhaps modern political party way that the Chartists organise. And again, there's kind of a lot of dismissal of female Chartism. So female Chartist societies do exist. Women do have their own societies, which are somewhat segregated from the male ones, but this is a cartoon from Punch from quite late. I think this is from 1848. Again, saying how do you get rid of female Chartists? You just get a man to release some rats and some mice and they'll run away. So again, quite derogatory attitude towards women's involvement in politics. But as I said, there's some quite interesting sources. If you've read Malcolm Chase's kind of magisterial history of Chartism, still the best book on Chartism, he looks at children in Chartism and how Chartist schools and Chartist families educate young women about democracy and the Charter. And there's examples like this embroidered sampler done by a young child. I think she was 8 or 9 years old, writing about the Charter and no surrender, which is quite a militant slogan for an 8-year-old child to embroider on a piece of cloth. But there is new research. Matthew Roberts of Sheffield Hallam's looked at the Women's Rights Association, which he argues is the first organised women's democratic society to argue for women's suffrage, comes out of Chartism. After Chartism starts to decline in the 1850s, they're the first kind of working class group to publish in the papers, arguing for women's rights and using that word rights, which is kind of interesting, quite late to come in. So it's only really from the 1850s that women start to really talk about what Wollstonecraft was talking about in the 1790s, which is women's rights as a term. So that brings me to the end, really, in terms of it's only really in the 1860s that we see the start of what we now know as the formal female suffrage movement, organised by John Stuart Mill and his wife and their kind of intellectual circle in London, who put forward the first petitions to Parliament, explicitly arguing for female suffrage in 1866. And that's where we see the start of the women's suffrage movement, which then leads on to suffragettes in the 1890s. So it takes a long time for women to get the vote. Obviously, not until after the Fuss Award are women over the age of 30, married women over women with property and married women over the age of 30 get the vote. So it takes a long time for that idea that women should have a say in society, should be able to take part in politics. And I think it's partly because the separate spheres idea is prominent, but it's also the fight to get men the vote. It takes priority first of all. If you want to do more reading, there's a few suggested books which should be fairly available around that early period, around the 18th and turn of the 19th century about women in protest and Chartism. So I do recommend that you read those. I'm sure there's lots of questions. But finally, I've got a new book out. It doesn't talk about women's suffrage particular, but I thought you might be interested. It's an ideal Christmas present. It's coming out on the 1st of November. Contested Commons, which looks at protest from 1750 to the present day, and looks at all different types of movements. So please buy my book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katrina. And I think after that fantastic presentation, I'm sure we will all be rushing out to buy your book. Just wonderful, really, really excellent kind of grounding and a wonderful beginning to this series, which, as I should have said at the beginning, is jointly brought to you by the GFTU Educational Trust, the Marx Memorial Library, and the Working Class Movement Library.